Gators Breakdown episode 103 is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. And the co-host tonight is Will Miles from SEC Country. You can find Will on Twitter at WillMilesSEC. Will, we've kind of broken down and hopefully gotten over the losses to LSU in a way. Texas A&M coming up next for these Gators. And, it's still, even though it's been a few days, the LSU loss still stings a little bit, and a big game is coming up.
Now, it certainly does, but, that's one of the great things about football is every week you got a new one coming up. So, hopefully Florida can go out and get the bad taste out of their mouth, and that's what we'll talk about tonight.
For sure. And to talk about that, joining us tonight is David Walker, former Texas A&M quarterback, youngest quarterback in NCAA history at 17, a true freshman starting quarterback in the NCAA in 1973, a first at Texas A&M, All-Southwest Conference Freshman of the Year in 1973, was a Texas A&M 4-year starting quarterback. And Dave, you told me the only true 12th man figure in modern school history. What does that mean? And thanks for joining us here on Gators Breakdown.
Well, it's great to be here with y'all, David and Will. At Texas A&M, of course, the 12th man is a really big deal. And we had a young player named E. King Gill back in 1922 who became the first 12th man. He was called down from the stands. He was a former player. We got in a little trouble with injuries, and Coach called him down from the stands, and he stood on the sidelines and hoped to get in, but never did. And in 1975, I was a 2-year starter in 73 and 74. And I didn't play in 75. They benched me. They set me down. We lost 2 of our last 3 games in 74, and I think our head coach decided he wanted another quarterback, wishbone quarterback. So we went the whole season and went 10-0. And then going into our 11th game after beating Texas, we're number 2 in the country. Ohio State is number 1. And one of our quarterbacks gets hurt against Texas. And so I'm suiting up for the Arkansas game up in Little Rock. And if there's not a 12th man representative, like that around, if there is one, I haven't met him. And unfortunately, that was a game that we lost. And unfortunately for us, Ohio State would then lose to UCLA in the Rose Bowl. Arkansas went on to the Cotton Bowl and demolished Georgia. So if we win that Arkansas game, we got a good shot at the national championship. So I was the 12th man for that one game in 1975, and almost true to the sense as E. King Gill was back in 22.
Nice. So you finished your career as the winningest quarterback in A&M history and still ranked second 40 years later. Appeared in 42 games at quarterback, you said. Most in Texas A&M history. Held the single-game quarterback rushing record for A&M for 35 years at 182 yards until this guy named Johnny Manziel came along. So, and you made sure to tell me, and this is important for the podcast, the only A&M quarterback to ever beat Florida.
That is correct. Now, we got a small sample right there.
Right, exactly.
Obviously. We didn't play many SEC teams whenever I was there, but we've only played Florida 4 or 5 times, I think, in the history of the 2 schools. So I did get my win in 1976. In fact, I'd left the team and was asked to come back by R.C. Slocum after that 75 season because I wasn't getting anywhere. I was on the scout team playing against our number 1 defense, which was in 75 the number 1 defense in the country. And so in 76, I was able to get my job back. We had a tremendous season, finished 10-2, and capped it off with a Sun Bowl win against Florida. And it's the only year A&M has ever beaten Texas in Austin, won a bowl game, and finished in the top 10 in the history of the school. So those were some good times for Texas A&M football. When I got to A&M, we had won, our record was 48-102 in my lifetime. And during my time there, we won 8, 10, 10, and 8. And that 1976 year was the best year, coming off that 75 loss in Arkansas. And then ripping through our schedule, avenging the loss in Arkansas, and then getting matched up with Florida after the Texas win, and winning that one fairly easily. Doug Dickey was the coach then. Florida was running the wishbone. But odd as it may sound, their wide receiver was probably their most famous player, Wes Chandler.
Yep.
And so we had a really good game. We had 3 or 4 All-Americans playing for us. Lester Hayes, who great player for the Raiders, Mr. Stickum, and a superb middle linebacker, Robert Jackson, who was the 3rd or 4th consensus All-American linebacker at A&M, well, of any position. And we had a kicker named Tony Franklin. Tony Franklin was the outstanding offensive player of that Sun Bowl victory over Florida. He hit a 62-yarder field goal, which was the longest at the time. So incredible year in '76, capped off by the win against Florida. And that's one game Johnny didn't win. Johnny's first start was at home against Florida.
Yeah, you guys had a canceled game the week before, right? And
had to cancel a game against Louisiana Tech because of a hurricane. And, perhaps if we'd have been able to play that Louisiana Tech game and gotten him ready to go and the rest of the team ready to go, may have beaten Florida. I mean, we'll never know.
Right.
And that, Florida's really been good to Alabama. And I was thinking about this. In 2012, let's say A&M beats Florida. They beat Alabama, as everybody remembers, that great game in Tuscaloosa. A&M would be going to the conference championship.
Right.
Play Georgia, I believe.
Yep.
And let's say A&M wins that, then A&M's going on to play Notre Dame in the national championship. But Florida cost them that chance because they lost to Florida. A&M did, and they also lost to LSU.
LSU, yeah.
Now, you look at 2015, which was the other Alabama national championship. Look at Ole Miss. Ole Miss beats Alabama, but loses to Florida. Yep. Well, let's say Florida's not on the schedule, and Ole Miss, runs the table and loses that 53-52 game to Arkansas. Then you've got Ole Miss going into the conference championship game against Florida, which Alabama did. And Alabama, of course, beat Florida and went on to win the national championship. So Florida has played big in both of Alabama's last 2 national championships because they beat the teams that beat Alabama during the regular season. So anytime A&M plays Florida, I mean, it's huge, particularly going down to the swamp. Recent memory, I can't remember the last time that A&M's been at Florida, if ever. So if it was back in the 40s or the 50s or whenever they last played before '76. But looking forward to a great game. But that was a tremendous year, 1976 for the Aggies.
Yeah. Dave, let's dive into this game a little bit. Both teams coming into this game after a loss, but it still looks like Texas A&M might just feel a little bit better about themselves after playing a tough game versus Alabama. While Florida is still kind of licking their wounds and losing a game they probably shouldn't have lost to LSU. What's the feeling around Aggie land about the good performance versus Alabama and then facing a Florida team coming off a loss to LSU?
Well, I think everybody at A&M was really happy and pleased about, I think, the fact that the Aggies hung in there against Alabama. My first thought was, you start playing some defense and you get respectable all of a sudden. And we played some great defense, I thought, against Alabama. We held Jalen Hurts, their quarterback, to a season-low QBR. I think he was like 42nd in the country this last weekend. And although we only got 230 yards passing, 70-something rushing, there's a lot of teams that don't do quite that well against Alabama. So just the fact that it was a low-scoring game, in the end, a tight game, I think should give Texas A&M and all of our players, a positive feeling going towards Florida. When I played, I never felt good about any loss. I mean, there was just no reason to. but we were never a 25-point underdog at home as the Aggies were this last weekend. So I think the fact that we just played respectable and we played really good defense, and the offense had some good spurts. I think the Aggies are looking forward to this next week and hopefully the next 6 ball games. We have a habit at A&M, as y'all are probably aware, of going 5-0 and then finishing the season at 3-5 or such. And we would be 5-0 right now, or 5-1 anyway, had we beaten UCLA, which we had a 34-point lead in. So everything is going about the way it's always gone. And now we have to go to Florida, and it's going to be a big game for both teams. I think Florida wins. I mean, they can go on to great things. I think you have Georgia the next week.
Yeah, bye week and then Georgia. Yep.
Right. And I know Florida's a 3-point favorite right now. 24-21, I think, is kind of where it's 27-24 is kind of where it is right now in Vegas anyway. And it's a key game for A&M, but A&M has been known to win some ball games, on the road. We've got a winning record on the road in the SEC, but we have a losing record at home thus far at 8-12. So we got a lot of young players, but we have young players every year. It seems that every year they're saying, "Oh, y'all so young." Well, when are we going to get old? When are we going to have all those juniors and seniors starting like Alabama does? Seems to every year. So yeah, we're looking for some improvement. I think we got the improvement that we needed to have last week, and that we'll be looking even more so this next Saturday in Gainesville.
So you mentioned A&M's abilities on the road. Certainly, Kellen Mond didn't play great against UCLA in the one road game that he had, but certainly he's improved since then too. And so what specifically do you think he's improved on? And do you think that carries over to the game on the road in Gainesville, or are there some things that should concern Aggies fans going on the road, like, and some things that might repeat themselves from that UCLA game?
Right. Well, the Arkansas game was a real test for him. I mean, that was another overtime game. It was tight. I think he's got a good eye. He's got a quick eye. In other words, he can glance at an area and throw and have a lot of confidence that the ball is going to be there. He's an excellent scrambler. I think we saw that against Alabama the other night. He is a good runner after he breaks the line of scrimmage. I'm really, really excited about him because he's only a freshman, and I get a lot of talk, with folks who talk about redshirt freshmen and true freshmen, and almost as if they're the same animal. But there's a lot of difference between a redshirt and a true freshman, and he has come in here from Allen High School, and I think done a wonderful job. He tried to get the starting job at the beginning of the season, and he didn't. And, of course, he was second team going out there to UCLA. And when the starter got hurt, well, it was his time. And I think we probably put a little bit too much pressure on him in that game, particularly in the second half. Threw the ball a little bit too much. We were a little too reckless. We should have run the ball more and run some clock. And I think we probably, as anybody would think, should have got that win. But I think we've done a much better job of looking at game situation at down and distance and grooming him, if you want to call it that, because he is getting better. And if you're a true freshman quarterback, 18, 19 years old, and you go out there and you play against an Alabama who arguably has the best football players in the country, and you come out of it on your last drive, you scored a touchdown, you're a recovered onside kick away from maybe tying it up. I mean, those are some confidence builders right there. And right now he's 4-1 as a starter. I think the team believes in him. I think the way that he handled himself the other night was very encouraging. And we should I think he's going to have an excellent career. And all of us who are, the winningest or second winningest or third winningest quarterbacks on that line, I think those records are probably in jeopardy. as we go forward.
David, Will and I kind of previewed the season, before the season started, and we looked at this A&M game and was like, okay, we noticed, of course, we're playing Texas A&M the week after Alabama, and and you briefly mentioned it before. Those losses to Alabama have derailed seasons for the last few seasons for the Aggies. What are signs that may not be the case this year? Is it something you've seen on offense? Is the defense picking it up a little? Do guys, have a run game you can kind of rely on? Is there one thing you can point to where you say, you know what, this may be different this year?
Well, I've always had a thing as a former coach and quarterback about having a tight end in your offense. And I did see us line up with the tight end once against Alabama, which was encouraging. Didn't do anything with him, but still, it was still encouraging. But our running game has been sporadic, but it's also been very sound. I think we have a really good scheme. Travion Williams I've loved him since he was a freshman running back. He's our leading rusher. Then we also have, of course, Ford, who is also a really good running back. So, and we got a couple behind them who've gotten some playing time, who have shown some promise. But our running game has to continue to improve. We had 70 yards on 30 some odd carries the other night against Alabama, which doesn't sound really strong. But our running game and I think an improved defense is what most people are going to be hanging their hat on the rest of this season in terms of how this season is going to pan out. What Coach Sumlin has to do is he's got to, we're looking to win 9 or 10 games, and he's got an opportunity to do that. I think with the showing against Alabama, everybody's expectations have risen some. And I think his players have to play up to that level of the expectations. And it all starts here, Saturday with Florida. It's a road game. Again, we've got a lot of young players who, really haven't been on the road except for UCLA. This is the first SEC road game because really at Arkansas and Arlington, that really doesn't count going into, a stadium like you have there in Gainesville. So it's going to be a real experience for not only mine, but also all the other true freshmen who are getting so much playing time right now for the Aggies.
So you mentioned the running backs. There's also, the running backs, the 3 main running backs, Williams, Ford, and Bussey, have 23 catches between those guys as well. How do they get those guys the ball? And is that something you expect to see a lot of against Florida, given the issues that Florida's had at linebacker, particularly covering screens against Tennessee and LSU last week?
Yeah, I tell you what, they showed a couple of new sets. They had the double twin set last week against Alabama. They're flaring, hitting some flare patterns out of the backfield with the running backs, which I find that interesting. It's basically ends up a no-back set after you send him in motion. And, well, really, besides the running backs, I think Christian Kirk. Christian Kirk's the most dynamic player that we have on the field, and the slot receiver. And he's only getting 5 touches a game. And he's 27 receptions, 3 carries. Man, I'd love to see him getting more than 5 touches a game. He's a kick returner, he's a punt returner, and all that's fine and dandy. But, man, I'd run some jet sweeps with that guy, get him the ball on handoffs. I'd throw some screens to him. It's just that it seems like we're just wasting such a great talent right there that really could be proficient, help our proficiency quite a bit. When you see us on 3rd and 5, you can pretty well guarantee that we're going to run the option route to number 3. I mean, that's what we do on 3rd and 4, 3rd and 5. And I just like to see him get the ball more than those situations when everybody knows the ball's coming to him, and open it up a little bit that way. Otherwise, though, I think we're doing a good job in terms of the running game. We have some very talented. All 4 of those backs that you named are all very talented, and the quarterback is very talented. Now we're not a read option team. We're not a zone read team. We never have been. Even when Johnny was here, we didn't do that. But I think overall our quarterback situation is probably better than it has been since Johnny was here. You know, we had a pretty good quarterback last year, no doubt about it. You know, the kid who came in from Oklahoma and filled in for 1 year. Yes, Trevor Knight. But I think this Kellen Mond has a really good future. And I think that as we learn what he can do and what he's most comfortable with, I think we'll improve and you know, get a few wins under his belt.
David, John Chavis, you know, reputation, long time for defensive coordinator, especially at Tennessee. So Gator fans know him well. Moved down to the sideline this season, down from the booth, and seems to have made an impact on the defense. And, you know, the more I've read about Texas A&M this week, he's really made a mark at the linebacker position. So, you know, is it just as simple as a move from the booth down to the sideline to get where he can just talk to these guys when they come off the field? And, you know, we've known that the struggles A&M has had on the defense and especially stopping the run. Is that something that has made an impact of him being on the sideline and being able to communicate better with the defense, but especially this linebacker position?
You know, it may be. It may be. You know, when I played, we had the #1 defense in '75. We had the #2 defense in '74, the #3 defense in '76 in the country. we were outstanding, and we had a defensive coordinator named Melvin Robertson. We called him Mad Dog. That was his nickname. And he was, you know, we played like our coach. We played like our defensive coordinator. And we would not have been able to do what we did with him up in the press box. There is just no way. He was that important to our defense. I mean, you know, he would yell and he'd scream and he would spit be flying all over the place. And, you know, he was just one of those guys who you just loved to play for. And Chavis may not be that way. I don't know on the sidelines. But to have Coach Robertson up in the press box, I just couldn't imagine our defense being the same. So I think it's a wonderful, wonderful idea and a wonderful change that A&M has made, putting Chavis on the sideline. We now have both coordinators on the sideline. So I think, man, when you can get right in that player's face and you can tell them what's going on, and they're not having to put on the phones to listen to you up there in the press box, but you're eye to eye with them and nose to nose, it makes all the difference in the world on defense. Defense is a different game from offense. Offense is, you know, cool, calm, and collected, you know, and a lot of analysis, and we're going to do this here and this there. But on defense, man, it's all about emotion. It's all about aggression. And I think having him on the sidelines in that capacity has done wonders for our defense, no doubt.
So beyond Armani Watts, there's a lot of youth in the secondary and at a couple of the linebacker spots. Is that really where you think Florida's going to have to attack? Or, you know, I mean, I don't know. I guess what's your opinion about where Florida needs to attack A&M?
Well, Texas A&M, they've got a couple of linebackers that are getting pretty good. Dodson and Alaka. Both very high on tackles. They both are extremely aggressive. They play tough. I think if you're talking about Florida attacking A&M, back in the day, you would say, well, they can pretty much do anything they want to, you know. But Florida's struggling a little bit on offense from what I could see against LSU. And I think A&M is going to try to man up with them like they did with Alabama. Just a lot of one-on-one battles, and let's see if we can get it done. The defensive line for A&M, you know, hasn't had a whole lot of publicity, but I really think the linebackers, and Watts is just amazing. Watts is everywhere, isn't he? I mean, if you watch any film at all, I mean, it's just incredible. Who's that number 44? He just seems to be he's in the backfield. I mean, you never know where he's going to be lining up, which, you know, can be tough on an offense, particularly like Florida's. Florida has a really good scheme. I like what they do. They do a lot of different packages, personnel packages, a lot of different sets. They do motion. They try to get you, you know, pretty much out of the area where they're going to attack. But I just haven't seen a whole lot of offensive proficiency out of them yet. I think this is going to work to A&M's advantage. I don't think it's going to be a very high-scoring game because Florida's got such a great defense. They always play great D. Wouldn't you agree? Just a great defensive team year in and year out. But right now they got a young quarterback. They got two real good running backs, I think, and A&M's defense should match up pretty well with them. It's going to be a really good test for A&M, being on the road, playing against kind of an old-style offense. I mean, it did look kind of like the 70s last week with LSU and Florida.
Gator fans do not like that, David. They don't like that. They want the Spurrier fun and gun and the Urban Meyer spread them in 40, 50 points a game. So, when you're saying 70s offense, Florida fans don't like that too much.
That's when I fell in love with Florida. I'm an SEC guy. I grew up in Louisiana, and except for the 5 years that I was at A&M, I just loved the SEC. And Steve Spurrier was probably the first coach that I ever felt like, man, I want to be like that guy. I mean, he was just incredible and had all the success in the world. And then you get a guy, Urban Meyer comes in, and a Tebow comes in who's left-handed like myself. So I would find myself many Saturday afternoons looking up that Florida game to watch the Gators play. No doubt about it. Now, your boy from Colorado State, runs a little different set than y'all are accustomed to, and I can see how that could put a little pressure on a guy. And at A&M, the reverse is true. We've always been a conservative outfit. We from Emory Ballard to R.C. Slocum, Jackie Sherrill even, all the way down the line until now we go to the air raid. And I tell you, it took some getting used to for a lot of Aggies. Not having a tight end lined up there, not huddling and all this kind of stuff. But we had so much success the first year. Well, everybody bought into it. Yeah. And now, it's getting to be where, what are we going to do next? What are we, it's kind of like the wishbone in its latter stages at A&M with Emory Ballard. It came a point in time where people were tired of seeing the wishbone because it didn't have the ultimate success. And, I've been wondering about your left-handed quarterback over there recently myself, Malik Zaire. When he was at Notre Dame, it was early in the season when he got hurt, but he was having a heck of a year. He looked like a great quarterback. And then, of course, he loses his job and can't get it back in the spring and is real upset about that, stays for another year, and then comes to Florida. And I've been wondering kind of where he's been or what his situation is at Florida. I saw he made a tweet the other night, I think you're probably aware of, SMH, what.a.shame. And talking about, obviously, the LSU game. So, there's a lot of stuff going on over there. I know Franks he looks like a real solid kid. But he's still got so much to prove in the passing game. You had a real shot the other day when you're on your 40-yard line with 8 minutes to play.
Yep.
and you get into the trips formation with the tight end. And every time y'all go to the wide trips formation with the tight end, you're going to be thrown to that 3-receiver set. Your tight end's going to be staying, blocking. Your back's not coming out of the backfield. So you got a combination route over there with your trips. Well, LSU knows this, and they bring him and they sack him, and it's game over.
Yeah.
So
there was not one, and I posted a picture of that play, Dave, and there was not one receiver even close to being open.
No, because they knew exactly what was coming because you'd shown it to them the whole game, and then the next time you get the ball, you're on the 5-yard line after a great punt. So, and that was right towards the end. Of course, you turned it over on downs after that. So there are things with the Florida offense that I think A&M's defense can take advantage of, and it probably starts there with the quarterback. So we'll see if Zaire gets a shot at it. I thought he was a tremendous athlete whenever I saw him the few times that I did at Notre Dame, and if your coach thinks that Franks is the guy, then Franks is going to be the guy, but he needs to become the guy.
That's what we're waiting on. That is exactly what we're waiting on, and then we'll see if it can happen. But Will, you got anything else for David?
No, I'm good. Just thank you for the time. Really appreciate it.
David
Y'all are
Walker.
welcome. Thank you very much.
Yeah, David Walker joining us here, former Texas A&M quarterback. David, thanks for the insight. Thanks for all the Aggies insight, and heck, even talking a little bit of Gators at the end and shedding some light on what you see from a player's perspective and a coaching perspective.
You bet. Appreciate it, guys.
Thanks, David.
Good luck to you.
Thanks. You too. All right, Will. So yeah, I mean, you're looking at David pointed out some things there, and we've put out some some film review. We've put out some pics of what we've seen on offense, and and David even showed it to us that some of the things that we see from afar, he is seeing the same things.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really argue when somebody gets on and says, "Hey, you always run that route combination out of that formation." It's a problem. It's a problem when you're doing that. It's a problem when there aren't deviations from that, right? So you can have the same formation, but you got to have different routes coming out of there. You got to have wrinkles. You've got to have different things like that, and they don't necessarily do that. So you're going to struggle, especially in critical downs when, again, maybe they even have deviations from those routes, but it's pretty clear that in critical situations, they go to the play that they've repped the most, and the defenses know that.
Yep. So, we'll talk some more Aggies here. I mean, this Alabama game, and we'll talk about it a lot because that was a big point of when I brought it up with Dave, when we went through every game of the season, and, this is the game we pointed to because, hey, much like Vanderbilt, they're coming off a game against Alabama. When you play Alabama, you don't necessarily play well the week before. From 2014 to 2016, Andy Staples had an article about Kevin Sumlin and his time at A&M right now, and what this Alabama game has meant to them. But from 2014 to 2016, Texas A&M entered the Alabama game with a combined record of 16-2, lost each time, and then went combined 8-10 afterwards. So, this is a game where, you go back and look at those games. A lot of those games, there were A&M was so hyped, and there were some big games coming up. Game day would be there, and is after the Manziel upset, can it happen again? And then Alabama would come and they would just steamroll them. It wouldn't even be games. Well, you know what? This past week, A&M gave them a game, and this was a game that was a fourth quarter game that had a chance to score late through an interception going into the end zone, and Alabama just kind of gets the win after that. But I don't think this is going to be the same falling apart A&M team as we've saw in the past.
No, and that's going to be a problem. I think in the past, if you look at A&M, they really hadn't played anybody coming into the Alabama games. Not necessarily. I mean, I'm not saying that they would play just all cupcakes, but Alabama was really the first real challenge for them. And then they got beaten. Then they got into the teeth of their schedule, and they were just sort of, they were an 8-5 team. It just so happened that their first 5 games weren't as difficult as their last 7, and so that's where the 5-0 followed up by the 3-5 comes from. I think this year, you start out going on the road to UCLA and you lose the game, but it's competitive. Like David said, they had a 30-plus point lead and then blew it after the quarterback got injured. You bring in a true freshman quarterback, and all of a sudden the lead starts evaporating. I mean, that's kind of a special circumstance to lose that game. I don't think it necessarily speaks to the team being elite, but it doesn't take elite to beat Florida right now. And so, the only thing I'd caution you with the Alabama game is that game was what, 27-3 or 24-3.
Yeah, at one point.
And I haven't gone back and watched all the film, but you got to imagine that Alabama sort of let up on the gas pedal a little bit. And sometimes it's hard to jam that thing back down, particularly on the road, and give A&M credit for taking advantage of it, because other teams haven't. Other teams have just gotten steamrolled. But, considering that Alabama had beaten the last 2 opponents by combined 100 points, it's sort of natural to take your foot off the gas when you get up by 3 touchdowns. And so, I think the score, the last touchdown for A&M came with less than a minute to go. So the score was actually a little bit closer than it looks. But again, even if you're within 2 touchdowns of Alabama, that's a pretty good team, especially considering the results we've seen on Florida's side thus far.
Yeah, we kind of reviewed the season here from them. You mentioned the UCLA game. They came back. They struggled against Nicholls State in week 2. Kind of okay, yes, you shouldn't struggle against them, but it kind of happens after a big opening week game. The way they lost, okay, you can kind of excuse it a little bit. Then they played Louisiana Lafayette. That was kind of a close game until they pulled away late. Went into overtime against a not very good Arkansas team, 150-43. Beat South Carolina by 7 a week later after that, and then the Alabama game last week. So kind of what A&M has coming into this Florida game. And, it's weird looking at this game, I think, in a way, because they are bringing a freshman quarterback into the swamp. He had a pretty good game against Alabama in that defense. Florida's defense overall is allowing 156 yards rushing per game. A&M offense is averaging 224 rushing yards a game. That ranks 4th in the SEC. The Gators are coming off a game where they gave up 216 rushing yards to LSU, but no, not in the traditional fashion. A lot of those jet sweeps we're killing Florida, but that's it seemed to be a problem. And A&M, you bet watch some tape on that and can throw their own type of misdirection in there. So I think when you look at Kellen Mond, Trevion Williams, Keith Ford, and Bussey there, that I think from what they saw in the LSU game and what they've seen, and you brought it up, Will, where the linebackers have had trouble keeping up with the running back screen game. I think you're going to see a lot of misdirection and some running backs get the ball in their hands through the air and see the mismatches they can pair with these Florida linebackers.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a little bit difficult to compare some of the numbers because just they've played completely different schedules. So UCLA is not a good defensive team. Louisiana is not a good defensive team. Arkansas is not a good defensive team. So and when A&M's played South Carolina and Alabama, they've scored a lot less points, but they have scored more points than those teams are giving up. But when you look at Florida, they've played teams like Michigan, who are pretty good defense, Kentucky, who's ranked 35th overall against FBS, LSU, who's ranked 27th. So I sort of have looked at the differential. So if you look at it, A&M's averaged 36.4 points, but their opponents have only given up 30.8 on average. Florida has scored 20.8 points when you eliminate the pick sixes, and their opponents have given up 23.6. So Florida's underperforming on offense compared to their opponents, and A&M is overperforming on offense compared to their opponents. That's a bad sign. Because, and you see the same thing on the defensive side of the ball, where A&M's opponents have averaged 34.6 points, but A&M's only giving up 30.6. So again, you look at A&M's defense and you say, okay, they're giving up 30 points. They must be bad. But compared to the offenses they're playing, I mean, UCLA has the number 11 ranked offense. Alabama has the number 7. Louisiana has the 38th. So they've played some pretty decent offenses. And yes, they've given up some points, but compared to what those teams are scoring against other teams, it's less than that. It's 4 points less. And Florida's the opposite. So their opponents haven't scored much at all. They've played some putrid offenses.
Right.
I mean, Tennessee's 107th, Vandy's 122nd, LSU's 103rd. Again, these rankings are all scoring points per game against FBS opponents. So I try to throw out the cupcakes, but so those defenses are giving up 22.4 points per game, or they're on average scoring 22.4, and Florida's giving up 24.2. So again, Florida's on the wrong side. The defense is underperforming compared to their opponent's average, and A&M is overperforming compared to their opponent's average. So it doesn't look good based on what I'm seeing, just based on the opponents, and that's concerning if you're a Florida fan.
Yeah, so numbers here, Kellen Mond, I mentioned him. Everybody knows the quarterback there. Trevion Williams, Keith Ford, Kendall Busey. Williams leads the Aggies in rushing with 422 yards, 5 touchdowns. Ford, 321 yards. Leads A&M with 7 rushing touchdowns. Mond, 266 yards, 2 scores. But he's also thrown for, of course, 1,045 yards. He has 7 touchdowns. And Busey, 218 yards, 1 touchdown. So that quartet of guys, Mond, Williams, Ford, and Busey, makes up nearly 91% of the ground production and nearly 94% of the team's rushing touchdowns. So there's your quartet of guys there. I would say you know who to stop. Those are the guys you got to stop. But you got Christian Kirk, who's a big time playmaker, who David said they need to get the ball to more. But it looks like if you can somehow concentrate on these 4 guys, maybe they can't spread the ball around enough to these guys. But Trevion Williams, Keith Ford, I mean, those are big time running backs. I like watching those guys. That quartet of guys there are the ones you really have to watch. And if Mon can start spreading the ball out to those guys on the ground and through the air, might be a long day for Florida.
Yeah, well, the last couple of weeks, so Vanderbilt had some real issues up front on the offensive line. LSU obviously had some issues up front with all the freshmen that were coming in for all the injuries on the offensive line. A&M doesn't have any of those issues. Their 5 guys are healthy. I think that's one of the big things coming out of the Alabama game is they're still healthy. And usually coming out of the Alabama game, you would expect them to have the injury list that's really, really long. And instead, Florida's got that injury list that's really, really long right now. And they're critical guys for Florida too. It's not just, it's not somebody who's a small contributor. I mean, it's people who are integral to what they're trying to do. So I do think there are a couple things for hope for Florida. One is that Mond played absolutely awful against UCLA. He was 3 for 17 in that game. And that's the only time we've seen him on the road. And traditionally, SEC quarterbacks, I went back and looked at, so in the article that's gonna be released later this week, I went and looked at SEC quarterbacks right now and so there were 9 of them who'd played as true freshmen, and they had a difference of about 30 in their quarterback rating between home and road, or home and away, if you counted their road and neutral stats. So they played way, way worse. They threw way more interceptions, threw way less touchdowns, and their completion percentage was like 10% less. So when you go on the road as a true freshman, it makes a difference. And, we heard David say that. I mean, he said, specifically that true freshman is different than a redshirt freshman. And it really is. That year of development makes a huge difference when you go on the road and sort of have to deal with the crowd. So Mond has splits that are similar. He has a 94 quarterback rating road and neutral. So that's the UCLA and the Arkansas game. And he's 135 at home. So if he puts up a 94 and throws a couple of picks, well, then Florida's going to be able to hang. So I think that's one area to draw some hope for Florida. The other area is I think they found something going single high safety on defense last week. Yeah. Now they sort of did it out of necessity to stop the jet sweeps, and certainly I'm not sure A&M is going to let them get away with not having to face that again this weekend after seeing some of the success that they did. But you also saw that I think Florida was much more successful on runs up the middle because they had that safety drop down into the box. I mean, they dropped him down and said, hey, if you can beat us deep, beat us deep. And A&M didn't have the ability, or I'm sorry, LSU didn't have the ability to do that. I don't know that Mond has the ability to do that either. And so I still think the way you're going to have to attack A&M, put an extra guy in the box, stop the run, and dare them to beat you deep. And if they do, then you tip your hat. But I don't think that, the strength of Florida is the corners. And so, they're going to have to put it on them.
Yeah. One thing that can change that a little bit is Mon's legs. Florida's only faced one dual threat quarterback so far this year, and Stephen Johnson in Kentucky. And at one point, Florida trailed that game by 13 points. Danny Etling had a couple run here, and he's not a runner by any means, so don't get me wrong. But a couple times last week where they called design runs and it worked for LSU, but that was more of a catching Florida off guard. Florida knows Mon can run. So, like I said, you go back to Stephen Johnson and what he was able to do, against Kentucky. Florida was able to get in the backfield a good bit. It was Johnson making plays. So you're going to have to, keep contained. Your defensive end's going to have to keep contained. Hopefully, if this defensive line is aggressive, they're not too aggressive to where Mon can, make something happen with his legs. So that's one interesting or one different factor that, we haven't seen it much this year where Florida's had to play some mobile quarterbacks. So I'm eager to see how they adjust to that as well.
Yeah, interestingly, A&M isn't necessarily converting a bunch of third downs. They're 39% conversion on third downs, right around where Florida is, really. Yeah. So they're having trouble staying on the field as well. Now certainly Mond can extend some drives with his legs, but it doesn't. He hasn't necessarily done that, or at least that's part of their third down package. So again, I think Florida's key is going to be to limit the runs early to force Mond into 3rd and 5, 3rd and 6, 3rd and 7 downs where the quarterback draw isn't necessarily something you want to run, downs where even if he can get loose a little bit, you can still bring him down behind the first down marker, things like that. 3rd and 2, 3rd and 3 is going to be an issue because you're going to have to spy him, and that dedicates a resource that you'd rather dedicate to stopping a running back or spying on the jet sweep.
Yeah, okay. I'm glad you said that because yeah, the 3rd and 3, 3rd and 2. That's the expect where I definitely expect to see some misdirection as well after last week. So, anything else on the Gators defense versus this A&M offense? Like I said, I really like A&M's running backs, but Florida's run defense has improved as the season has went along, and Darius Guys for everything for as good as a running back I think he is. Florida shut him down for the most part last week. So I've liked this defensive lines matching up against the last few opponents of Florida's that they faced the last few weeks. I'm not so sure I like this one a lot, but I still think there's enough there that those guys can have a good game.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Florida defensive line is clearly, I mean, the corners I think are probably the strength of the defense, but the defensive line has especially at times at defensive end has really made its mark. Tackles for loss, things like that. You get Mond into 3rd and 16, 3rd and 17, and make him throw, and now you're really putting A&M in a situation where they're doing something they don't want to do. So you get a couple of those tackles for loss, drive them back, and you have the ability to maybe turn the game on a turnover or something like that. And we've seen that. I mean, we saw that against Tennessee. I mean, the pick six was critical to Florida winning that game. And that really came with pressuring Dormady and forcing him to make throws that quite honestly he just shouldn't have made. And if you can force Mond to do the same thing, he's on the road. He's a true freshman. It's his first road start. Obviously he got some experience at UCLA, but the Swamp's a little bit different environment than the Rose Bowl too. If the fans show up and they're loud, it's going to be a difficult day for him.
Yeah. This just did kind of go through my head. The A&M, we know they like to spread it out. And so the tackling, the lack of tackling we've seen from this defense, this is another game where this can really rear its head. A&M will spread it out. There'll be a lot of one-on-one matchups. There may be some linebackers in some situations where they're going to have to get the right angle. They're going to have to make the tackle. Chauncey Gardner as well. He really had a great way to bounce back for him the way he did in this LSU game. But I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities in this game where one-on-one, you're going to have to make your play.
Well, and everything's interconnected. So I really think that comes back to the defensive tackles. So if the defensive tackles can get penetration and can stop the run, then that allows you to put in your nickel defense. And clearly, clearly just the depth and the weakness of Florida's defense is at linebacker. And, you and Bill mentioned it last night that Gardner played really, really well in the game against LSU. He came up, he filled the hole, and he really took guys down when he had the opportunity. The issues for tackling were at the linebacker position on throws to the running back. And so if you can bring in extra defensive backs because you're able to stop the run, then you have a better ability, I think, of combating what A&M's trying to do. The good news is when you spread out, it's usually smaller guys that you're trying to tackle, not necessarily a big running back coming out of the backfield. And you don't have to necessarily go all the way across the field from where the linebackers are positioned to track that running back. So it'll be interesting to see how A&M attacks. I actually expect them to attack quite a bit with the running backs. I expect them to throw a lot to the running backs, get them out in space against the linebackers. That's just really the area where I think if you look at the film, you say, hey, that's where we're going to have to attack.
Oh, yeah. So moving to the other side of the ball, Will, the Aggies defense held Alabama last week to under 400 yards. So Alabama hadn't been held to that low of yardage since the season opener against Florida State. But they have an even better pass rush than LSU, able to come up with 9 tackles for loss. And 3 sacks against Alabama last week. After that game, the Aggies ranked 2nd in the nation in sacks. This comes after a game where Florida gave up 5 sacks, 4 in the first half last week. Not all in the offensive line, as we mentioned in the previous podcast. Frank's his inability to get rid of the ball and go into the pressure himself lends itself to that too. But this is where I'm afraid for the Gators here is this. Their ability to create pressure in the backfield, Frank's inability to get rid of the ball. This is where the game scares me the most.
Oh, it should. This is where it should scare you. So I like looking at tackles for loss as a percent of total tackles because that really tells you something about explosion of the defense. And Florida's at 10.3%, which is pretty explosive. So the teams like Tennessee, teams like Kentucky have been down around 7%. And so in those games, I've sort of said, hey, Florida's offensive line probably has an advantage here because of those types of things. A&M's at 12.9%. So 12.9% of their total tackles are happening in the backfield. They are in the backfield a ton.
Whew.
And Florida does not do well with 2nd and 13 because they're going to run the ball. And so it's a key to the game. I mean, literally, and you look at it, and Armani Watts, the safety, is one of the leaders. He's got 7 tackles for loss already this year. So it'll be interesting to see how Florida attacks. I mean, that indicates that there's quite a bit of blitzing. There's quite a bit of bringing people up and run support, stuff like that. Because if your safety's coming up and making those tackles for losses, it's something that you could exploit, but Florida hasn't really shown the ability to exploit something like that yet. You mentioned earlier separating one-on-one downfield, having routes, pick plays, things like that. Because if you think you're going to get one-on-one coverage and you run a pick, the guy should run open.
Yeah.
You might get a pass interference call, an offensive pass interference call, but most of the time they don't call that. So, again, I think this is the key to the game. I think if A&M does anything like they did against Alabama, it's going to be really tough sledding for Florida.
Yeah, they had 9 tackles for loss that game. That's the second most they've had since South Carolina game. They had 12 in that game. So you're right. I mean, the number of tackles for loss, the number of times they're in the backfield, it is a little scary. So, and you're right. I do think it lends itself to big plays if you can. If you're creeping those guys up, and Malik Davis squeezed it much like the Vanderbilt game in a way, but that was a different situation. But just in a way, kind of that play. You get the defense drawn up, you break, you get to the hole, you make one move, and hopefully, you're off to the races. So I don't necessarily know if that can happen on first down, as you were saying. Florida, can they get creative on first down? Can we see some more misdirection? We talk about seeing it from the A&M defense. Or A&M offense? Can we see it from the Florida offense? That's the big question, because that's one of our main complaints about what we see. But this defensive line. That is the disadvantage I see right now in favor of A&M. But they're playing well. This Texas A&M defense. Last week, Tyler Dodson, 16 tackles with a sack. He had 2.5 tackles for loss himself against Alabama. But their linebackers are getting much better too. I mentioned Dotson, Alaka, and Dotson leads the team in tackles, and Alaka is third in the team in tackles at the linebacker position. So those guys together, Dotson and Alaka, are averaging about 14 stops a game at the linebacker position. So that it was a strength of, a position of weakness for this A&M defense for a while, because there were these last few years, you have been able to run on Texas A&M pretty much at will on defense. But led by these two guys, they're looking much better. And it's just I have to take a look at it, not just the defensive line for Texas A&M, but it's this front seven that I really think will give Felipe Franks a lot of trouble.
Yeah, so they have 11 forced fumbles this year. In their games, 11 forced fumbles. They've recovered 7 of them. They also have 5 interceptions. So if you were to predict who's going to win the turnover battle, you really got to predict A&M's going to win it, because Florida's defense they've got their 5 interceptions and the 3 pick sixes, but they've only got 1 forced fumble the entire year, which,
and nothing in the last 3 games.
Well, and so, as the talent level's going up, the turnovers are going down. Though, again, they had a couple against Michigan, so maybe that's not fair. But again, I go back to that 11 forced fumbles. You mentioned the 23 sacks that A&M has. All the tackles for loss. They're going to be in the backfield. And one of the interesting things, and I do wonder, maybe this will be good for Florida from the standpoint of, if you drop and play zone, that's really given Franks trouble, because having to go from one read to a second read to a third read is just not his strength. If you blitz, it's a hot read. Like, you throw where the blitz is coming from. So if he can recognize where the blitz comes from and just deliver the ball, that's really his strength. And so maybe from that standpoint, if A&M decides to bring pressure, Franks can take advantage of it. Or if A&M decides that they're going to drop back into zone and play a ton of zone, that's not really what they want to do. It's not what Chavis has done historically. And so maybe you're sort of getting them out of their framework, and they're not firing forward as much, and then you can get the running game going. But, I don't know. All the tackles for loss, all of the sacks, all the forced fumbles indicates to me a team that's really strong up front, and Florida's really struggled with teams that are strong up front in that front seven.
Yeah. I think we have to bring it up. Of course, the injuries, and We know, since we're talking about the offensive side of the ball, we still don't know if Cleveland will be available. McElwain had his press conference today and still sounds pretty doubtful that Kadarius Toney will play. Should be a big part of the offense, as we know. And as you mentioned, when we did our recap Sunday, no wide receiver screen receptions. Of course, we saw him in the Wildcat, but it's going to be a big loss if he's not out there.
Oh, I mean, he's the most electric player they have, which just goes back to the, identify who your players are and get it to them in space. And we've been talking, I think the impression is when you say, hey, get it to Davis and get it to Pirine, you're saying you should run the ball more. And that's not necessarily what I'm saying. So Florida has run the ball on 60% of its offensive plays, and that's just inherently inefficient because you don't average even if you're an elite offensive team from a running perspective, you just don't average as many yards per play when you do that. So if you look at Florida, they've averaged 4.3 yards per rush, and they've averaged 7.8 yards per pass. So when they're passing, they're actually moving the ball more efficiently than they are when they're running. It's just a question of being able to sustain drives and that sort of stuff from the pass perspective. And my opinion is that you need to focus on getting the ball to Pirine and Davis and whoever you think your skill players are in space through the air. Because then you're getting it to them with, you don't have to have 5 offensive linemen and a tight end execute perfectly if you're throwing a bubble screen. They just have to get in the guy's way. And so I think there's less places for the play to go wrong if you get the ball out in the air to your skill players. And the question is, are they going to be able to do that? And do they have any skill players to get it to, I suppose, is where we're coming to at this point. So, I mean, there's no doubt the loss of Toney is a huge deal. But maybe we'll finally see what Dre Massey can do because they'll put him back there in the Wildcat. And we'll finally see. I mean, is he the guy that we thought he was coming in, or is there just a huge difference between him and Toney? And we'll find that out.
I lean toward the way, you're 3-2. You've played 5 games. If he was the guy we thought he was, I think we would have seen it by now. We would have seen something by now. But and I really hate to say this, but with this offensive staff, who knows? I don't know. Maybe he is. Maybe he is unearthed as a big playmaker if Toney is unable to go. And I got an interesting tweet. And I didn't really think it brushed my mind quickly, but now when the question was brought up, I thought about it some more, and I'll ask you the same thing. And it kind of goes into the game plan of how Florida should play on offense versus A&M. Should they be ultra conservative and try and run the ball and limit A&M's possessions, or should they just try and unleash Frank and see what happens? So this comes from Ali Perry. Question: how long of a leash should we have with Felipe Franks this week? So I think, part of it does go into the game plan. If you want to come in and try and run the ball 50 times because that's what you can do well at times, and that's what can carry the offense at times, okay, then I think you do that in turn to limit Texas A&M possessions. But if you're going to come out and you're going to let Frank wing it, throw it all over the field and kind of see what happens, I just think you have to let him go and don't even let him worry about a leash.
I mean, I think he should play the whole game regardless. Yeah. You decided when you brought him back in for Del Rio that he's your starter. I mean, yep. You've decided that. And so to say, hey, now we're going to bring in Zaire, it would make sense if Zaire was a freshman, but Zaire's not a freshman. And so what are you trying to figure out with these games? I mean, if the team, even if you win this A&M game, even if you end up winning the East, I mean, and I think at this point it's kind of a long shot, but even if you win that, you're going to need to do it with a quarterback who's chucking the ball all over the place. You're going to need to, and this was always my problem with bringing in Zaire in the first place. I wrote when he came in, when he transferred, I didn't like the move because you have to know what you have with Franks. So I think Franks, I don't think they should take him out of the game. I think if they take him out of the game, it's a mistake. I think if they take him out of the game, it's because they're worried about not making it through this year rather than being worried about where the program's going. And the minute you start worrying about what's going to happen right now rather than what's happening in the future, and you start sacrificing the future for saving your job, that's a problem. So I think Frank should have the entire game. And like I said, if they bring in Zaire for anything other than a change of pace package, because they've specifically said we're going to do this, and he comes in for like a drive, or he comes in, it's like a planned thing where he comes in to give a change of pace. Anything other than that, I think is a major mistake.
And when we were previewing the season, I thought that would happen anyway. And I was on the Franks train for the longest time. I was like, you need to throw him in there, see what you have with him, build the offense with him. Now, I'm still. This is no excuse, but I still thought he would have Callaway, Scarlett. Not an injured Cleveland. Maybe could find some more playmakers. So I thought he would be able to be built with, all the playmakers we know that Florida can have in Scarlett and Callaway. But I still think you have to let him build with what you have right now. And before the season, I still thought, okay, but you still have to, not have to, but it would still be nice to see Zaire come in as a red zone threat, it's 3rd and 2, let him come in. He's got a big body. He's got a thick frame. Let him get those 2 tough yards. And with Tony being out now, I think, if you don't have the trust in Massey because we haven't seen anything this whole season, then I think you can throw Zaire in and let him be the wildcat quarterback per se. And you know what? If you want to pop a trick play with him, if you want to catch a defense off guard with his arm, I think you can trust him to do that. I still don't think you can trust Zaire to run the offense, and I still don't think that you can't trust Franks enough to let him just carry the offense in this game right now.
I mean, I guess the question is, what are we trying to accomplish? And if the goal is to not get beat by as many points as you might otherwise, then yeah, you can bring in Zaire and have him try to play quarterback, or you can try to be conservative and play things close to the vest. If the goal is to build into a program that's going to be taken seriously by everyone, then you have to start lengthening the leash for your quarterback. You have to let him throw the ball. And quite honestly, you got to set up things that are set up for him to succeed. So you have to do things like have one read and then a dump off to the running back. Well, it turns out the running backs are really, really good. And so if you slip them out just sort of, as the outlet, even if they have a linebacker on them, I think they're going to beat the linebacker. So all those things we see opponents targeting Florida's linebackers, I think Malik Davis is more talented than almost any linebacker in the SEC. Get him on a linebacker and take advantage of it. And there just hasn't been any of that. So, but again, I don't think that you say, hey, we're not having success with what we're trying to do here, and so we're going to completely change the offense. I don't think that makes any sense. To try to change it all now is just going to make everything haphazard. I mean, if you're not doing what you practiced for the last 6 months well, what makes you think you're going to be able to do something well that you've only practiced for a week or two? I mean, I get it, right? You look at it and the results are not matching what you want. And so you say something has to change, but that's just panic. That's what Peter Burns was talking about last week. Hey, you can't hit the ball into the fairway, so you start changing things with your swing rather than going to a coach who can help you fix what's really actually wrong. And I think maybe that's where the correction comes in, is saying, okay, within the framework of our offense, what do we need to fix to simplify things for the quarterback? Or what do we need to fix to get the ball to our playmakers in the air? Or what do we need to fix to free up our running backs in space so that they can make a play? Not, hey, let's completely change the offense to try to make it into something it's not. Nobody should want Florida to do that.
Yeah, and I think that's where the problem lies for fans, and for myself as well. I am a fan, and you're a fan, and we're fans first, and we do this for fun. But the limitations we see with Franks, is it because the coaches don't trust him with the limitations, and they're trying to keep it safe, not let him lose a game? Is it physical limitation? I mean, we know he has the big arm, or is it mental limitation? Is he not getting it? Is there too much on his plate? Are the coaches putting too much on his plate? If they dial back the offense, can it somehow make it worse?
I mean, I don't know how you're going to make it worse.
I know, but it is. I mean, I guess I'm not really explaining it very well, but I guess trust is one word. Do they trust him to be a guy to run the offense they have given him? Can they dial back the offense and he be more successful? Or I guess the ultimate decision here is it just a fail with him right now?
Yeah, so trust is an interesting word. I mean, you've mentioned that a few times over the last couple of weeks, and I think it rings true. But in any sort of business that you're in, or any sort of decision making that you have to make, at some point you got to decide what's good enough and what's perfect, right? And if you keep waiting for perfect, you never end up actually taking your product to market, or you never end up actually pulling the trigger on something that you should do. And so I think in some cases that's kind of what's happening with Franks, right? Is that, okay, that guy's not open, so I'm not going to let it go. But it's the right read, let it go and throw the guy open. I mean, it's good enough to give it a try. You're going to throw a pick every once in a while. We'll live with that. But you know what? But if that opens up the downfield passing, then great. I mean, you see all these offenses where the quarterback underthrows the guy on the outside in one-on-one coverage, and the receiver has an advantage and either goes up and high points the ball or gets a pass interference penalty. When you get one-on-one coverage, throw it to him. And to me, it's a, hey, trust your read, throw to your read. And from a offensive perspective, it's, hey, you put Franks in there, either trust him or get him out of there. And that's, now I don't think they should get him out of there. I think it's at this point, it's like, hey, we need to know what we have. Let's trust him. And if it turns out that trust isn't rewarded, then we know what we need to do. But the worst thing they can do is start ripping him in and out. And then you go into next season not knowing what you've got either. And you're sitting there, then all the questions are, well, what happened with his confidence going in and out and all that sort of stuff. Let's see. You give the kid 7 more games and he's going to, you're going to know what you have at the end of the year. And that's what we really ought to try to accomplish by the end of the year.
I guess the way I'm looking at it is who is putting who in the best position? Is he putting the coaches in the better position, or the coaches putting him in a better position? And I think that's where the gray area is we don't really know.
Well, now you're getting into the chicken and the egg argument, right? I mean,
we'll never know that answer. We just won't.
Well, you've got a segment of people who are going to blame Franks.
Yep.
And I actually think that's really unfair. I've heard some people really criticize him and sort of under the guise of protecting the coaches in some capacity. I just don't think that's fair. I mean, we talked earlier this week about running the same play on 3rd and 4th down. Well, whose fault is that? And then you look at always going to Powell in those critical situations, and there are so many times where the opponent is saying we knew what was coming. There were some articles that came out that Michigan was laughing because they knew what was coming during the game to start the season, and that's coaching. And the time management is coaching, and the defensive adjustments when they're made, that's coaching. The offensive adjustments, whether they're made or not, that's coaching. Not getting the ball to your playmakers enough, that's coaching. Not identifying your playmakers during spring and fall practice, that's coaching. So I think to sit here and say, hey, let's blame Felipe Franks for everything that's going wrong on offense, I mean, I just don't think that's fair. I mean, to me, the best excuse for the offensive staff is just all the suspensions and all the injuries. I mean, if you just said, if you took the top 3 wide receivers off of Alabama and their starting running back, even they would start to have some problems. And so, I do think, I'm not making an excuse, but I do think that is relevant in terms of who do you trust on the field? Do you have leaders out on the field? Like the guys who were leading in fall and spring camp, those guys aren't necessarily even with the team right now. And the void of leadership is certainly an issue, I would imagine. But, I'm not going to put this on Franks. I don't think it's him. I think there are things that he does well. There are things that he doesn't do well. I think the coach's job is to put him in a situation where he's able to succeed. And if they aren't able to do that, then that's on them. That's not on the quarterback.
I completely agree. I couldn't have said it better. Even though I tried to, I couldn't. All right, well, let's wrap this up. And what we think will happen this week, kind of a two-parter here. Is this game a must-win? And I'm saying only for this season, not for Jim McElwain's career. Is it for bowl chances, for perception, for Florida being a spark for the rest of the season? Is this game however you wanted to find it? Is it a must-win? And what happens?
So I think it becomes a must-win from a recruiting perspective, probably because you've got an open week before Georgia, and you've got to imagine that with the noise that's going to start bubbling up. I mean, after the LSU game, Twitter went nuts. I can't imagine 2 weeks after our 2 straight losses at home to SEC teams that, quite honestly, aren't the cream of the crop in the SEC. It's not going to be pretty, and I think that will. I know that a lot of the recruits after the LSU game said that they were still solid, but you got to wonder how long that lasts if Florida really starts going downhill. And if it looks like McElwain and Nussmeier aren't going to be there, what happens on the offensive side of the ball from the recruiting perspective? And that's really where the strength of this 2018 class is on the offensive side of the ball. And so, if Nussmeier leaves or if the heat really gets turned up on McElwain, you wonder what happens there. For the season, I don't know. I don't really expect. I mean, I guess I picked Florida to win the SEC East, but I really kind of expected to see a little bit better defense and a considerably better offense, and we just haven't seen that thus far. And we've seen sort of what Georgia's becoming. So I don't know that that's necessarily a realistic expectation. I think though, if you can win the A&M game, even if you lose to Georgia, and you can get to the FSU game at the 7 or the 8 win mark, well, that's actually a pretty decent job. Again, all things considered, the injuries, the suspensions, all that sort of stuff. I think you can look at that and say, hey, it didn't fall apart. The coaches were able to rally the troops, that sort of stuff. But I'm not anticipating a trip to the SEC championship game right now. I'm just trying to figure out how they're gonna beat the remaining SEC competition.
Same here. I kind of, explained my way on it was, getting bowl eligible. If you lose this game, then you have some tough road trips. With this Florida team and the way they would be playing, yes, Missouri would be a tough road trip. South Carolina would be a tough road trip. You're probably looking at Missouri and UAB as probably, if you want to say for sure wins, there's your for sure wins. Then there's your 5. There's 5 wins. So then you have to pick up a win somewhere else. And you would have Georgia. You had FSU, South Carolina on the schedule. So it is in a way. Of course, a bowl game is a goal of a team. I think that's one reason. Another reason this game is so important. So, Saturday night, it'll be a night game in the Swamp. First time the Gators have had a night game in the Swamp in quite some time, dating back to last year. So, Will, how do you see this one playing out?
Well, I mean, first let me say I do think Florida can win. Yes. But I think it's going to take a complete meltdown from Mond, or it's going to take an elite level performance from Franks. That's how they get it done. And so the question becomes, how likely is it that you're going to get a complete meltdown or an elite level performance? Now, I guess you could say if you get a solid to above average performance from Franks and Mond plays pretty poorly, maybe you win that game, where it's not a complete meltdown or not a complete elite performance. But that's really what I think needs to happen. Florida has to play a perfect game to win this one. I mean, they're not going to be able to turn the ball over. They're going to have to keep A&M out of the backfield. And I just don't think they can do it. I really struggle with what to pick this score, mainly because I don't think Florida's going to be able to hang. I think Texas A&M is going to win. I think it's going to be like 30-17 is what I'm picking. I think it's going to be pretty bad.
We'll agree, Will. That's 27-13 is the score. I got A&M. I just don't see it right now. But after what we saw last week, now Cleveland, Tony, especially if Tony's out. I see, this staff already having trouble getting the ball to the playmakers, and if your best playmaker's not on the field, besides Malik Davis, then what can this staff figure out to do on the offensive side of the ball? So I've lost a lot of faith in this staff trying to figure something out. And I think when you play a good, they're not a great defense by any means, but when you match it up against a good defense, that's why I see this becoming a problem. I think it's the defensive line that would give Franks a lot of trouble. I think they'll be in his face a lot. I don't think he'll react well under that pressure. Maybe, and I don't know how they come to attack it. Do they try and limit that by not hardly passing the ball? And if the run game is working early, do you see Florida try and run it 45, 50 times? I think, I know that's a high number, but with what we've seen, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. They may try it. But in order to see that, I think they have to start running it early to kind of see if it's there, and then build off of it and keep going and not put Franks in bad positions. But I just don't know. I don't know how they'll attack it. And I just really see in this front seven for A&M being the difference. And just kind of, I think A&M gets up, 10, 13, nothing kind of early. And just, Florida scores, I think. But in the end, A&M's not really ever threatened by the score.
Yeah, I think the thing to look for early is Florida throwing the ball to their running backs, because they hand off to their running backs a lot. But those 4th down and 1s are because you're getting 4 or 3 yards per run, and when you throw the screen passes, you get 5 or 6 yards, just sort of minimum. If they can find a way to get their running backs in space, I think they've got a shot. That's how they're going to have to attack A&M. Now, A&M's got some pretty good linebackers, but again, I think Malik Davis can make those guys miss, and I hope that's the adjustment that they make. I don't want them to completely shift the offense. I want them to find their playmakers in the game through the air and put them in space. And maybe that means throwing some screens to Swain. Maybe that means throwing some screens to Massey. Maybe that means doing something a little bit unconventional to get the ball through the air to those guys. That's the thing to look for, because that's the only way they're going to be able to hang with A&M, is they're going to have to put some points on the board. And to do that, it's going to have to be Malik Davis.
Yep, and that's kind of just where I don't see them putting points on the board enough to keep up with Texas A&M. But, we'll be sitting there. We'll be cheering these Gators on. I'm sure you and I will be texting back and forth like we have been all the games this season. But, like you said, it is a game they can win. This isn't, a great Texas A&M team by any chance. This is, they are coming to play on the road in the swamp. Florida's got those special jerseys, Will, and maybe that's some type of spark. A night game under the lights and some special unis. So for whatever, maybe there's some mojo that's going to work there.
Yeah, well, I hope I'm wrong, right? I am not one of those people who wants the losses to pile up so that so we can make a change right away. That is not what I want to see. I want to see the coaches succeed, but I also want to see the coaches make adjustments that are solid and make adjustments that are based on their philosophies and their plans. So, to go to a complete spread offense just isn't within their philosophy, and so that's not something I'd like to see. At least not extensively right now. You can bring in aspects of that, but not everything. So again, like I said, we'll be sitting there, we'll be watching, we'll be cheering, and certainly I hope it's 30-17 the other way. I just statistics don't really bear that out.
Yeah, unfortunately, like I said, I agree. So anything else, Will, before I let you go here, man?
No. Just again, thanks to everybody on Twitter. Thanks for everybody for listening. Appreciate all the engagement, and look forward to.
Been pretty the engagement's been pretty high this week for us.
Well, I expect that to continue, and win or lose, it's great to be a Florida Gator.
Absolutely. So for Will, you can read his articles on SEC Country. He'll have his Texas A&M preview up there. You can find him on Twitter at Will Miles SEC. I'm your host, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Thanks for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.